Hello, everyone. Once again, thank you for waking up early and making your way here to listen to our talk. Now, thank you for wonderful introduction. One thing I think it's worth mentioning is what I am not really PostgreSQL expert, right? And as I thought about that, I thought it would be more interesting for me not to try to pretend to be one and go deep on Postgres, but rather talk about the open source ecosystem and database ecosystem in general and how I see place of Postgres in it. Now, one thing I'm very passionate about is the open source in general, right? And I wanted to start by maybe sharing my perspective, which will color all what I will talk about. And I am the big believer that everything being equal, the open source software is better, right? Open source is wonderful, right? And what that also means is what for all of us collectively, it is a good idea to invest our time, resources, right, for businesses, into the open source rather than a proprietary software. Because if you invest in open source, well, you together with community benefits. And if you invest, for example, in Oracle, then what happens? Larry gets to get another boat or another island and, probably charge you more for the next version of Oracle, right? So that is how it is different. So, once again, we will talk here about the open source databases and, of course, Postgres. Now, as I think about the open source, I think it's interesting what we have now seen multiple distinct eras of the open source. The first one is what I would call like a stone age of open source. Few people recognize but really their open source was original way to develop software, right? Because in a not so good, but old days, the mainframes and stuff, right? The IP was the hardware, right? And the software was, just something you use with it, right? And the early adopters were expected to to debug it, fix bugs, to make it work, right? So it was open without a name, right? Now the second generation, that would be what I would call like romantic open source software, right? You can see a lot of people, and I think many of them are in this room, which went into open source because what a wonderful idea it is, right? How it can make our technical ecosystem and the world in a better place, right? It was not for money. If you guys have heard what Linus Torvalds, creator of Linux, spoke about why he created Linux. He said it was just for fun. He even wrote a book, right, with his name. Now the next stage, what happened? Well, we were successful in making open source great, right? And we came to this era of what mature open source. And I would put this just as one highlight, right, if I remember that era, like, IBM invest $1 billion in an open source. And of course, now $1 billion in open source sounds like nothing, right? You often have those companies building an open source businesses having many, $1 billion valuations, right? Like Red Hat was acquired by IBM for $34 billion, right? And so on and so forth, right? But reality is what we figure out what the open source is no more niche, which idealistic and romantic people will work with, but that is a mainstream and it's understood that is a good thing for enterprise to use, right? Now, here comes a problem, right? If something becomes good and people understand, that is fantastic, then it becomes, what's the word? Enshittified, right? By the way, that is a word of the year of 2004, I think, right? Because we use it, talk about a lot of services, right? Especially online services, right? I think the same happens with open source. Open source becomes great, right? And then you see a lot of business-minded people figure out how can we maybe call something open source, sell it like open source, but not actually provide all the values about the open source, because if you really think the open source can be bad for business, right? If you give your code and enable everybody about, including your competitors, right, to use it, well, it's a problem. Now, that comes us, I think, to this interesting thing, is what, if you look at open source, I think there are fundamentally different perspectives here, right? Different actors, right, and which can come at a conflict, right? And the most important, I think, duality here is one, there is the users of open source, because they want the real and as good as possible open source, and then on the other, is those commercial companies, investors, right, which want to see the monopoly, which creates an opportunity for them to make a maximum amount of money, right? And these are fundamentally at conflict. Now, what I think we have figured out in the last few years is what open source is not enough. And what I mean by that is if you define open source narrowly, like, oh, it is open source license, it's not really enough to meet the user needs. Because in many cases, you can release something as an open source license, but really kind of find your way to make that thing not quite usable. Now, if you think about the open source users, what do I think those folks need? Well, typically, we want to have a free option. And I call it free options because if you think about the enterprise don't want free. They understand it's typically free as a puppy, right? You still have to, take care of it, right, and wherever, right? They actually want something, paid in enterprise grade. But you also all want choice, not a single vendor for many reasons. You want safety, quality, support, ease of use. We also want to make sure we have a permissionless innovation, right? If we want to go ahead and say, hey, the vendor is not doing something, right? We can, hire people and write a patch ourselves, make it work for our needs. And I think that is a wonderful thing about the open source. Now, I was thinking about that and actually felt like, well, could I come up with some sort of, ranking criteria with that, right? And I did that for a bunch of projects, right? So this is my sort of like opinionated scorecard for Postgres, right? How I think it kind of ranks on the different dimensions, right? And I'm sure some of you will disagree with me, right? Maybe something like PostgreSQL have to be absolutely perfect on all dimensions, but this is opinionated. Now, as I spoke to more people, kind of sharing that with them, I found there is something else, right, that people care about, right? For example, we often see kind of, well, especially, lawyers, I don't like lawyers, but what, if you completely ignore lawyers, right, you can get into trouble, which is not good, right? So there are things like copyright handling, right? You need to know where different things come from, because if somebody says, oh, this is my IP, and you kind of stole it, you can, track where that comes from. Right? You often need to deal with patents, right? In the US, there is like a software patents which can be a problem, right? We have to deal with trademark, because this is kind of really kind of defines what is product needs, right? Or often people talk about the roadmap as well, because when we invest our time, resources, choose to adopt the open source software, it's often not just about what it is, but what we believe it strives to be. Right, so we want to understand the direction things are going. Okay, now let's talk about the thing which I think has been impacting the open source a lot in the last 2 years. Right now, it's not just the last year or two, but I think this impact is still important, right, and it's still kind of shaping the industry. And this is impact of a cloud, right, of course. Now, I think it's interesting how cloud impacts the open source, and I think it's very also different from what kind of open source is that. On one extent, the cloud is wonderful for open source because it really simplifies adoption of a lot of open source software, right, especially for not so technically advanced people, right, and so that really maximizes accessibility, right, which is loved by the open source community, right? but it also changes their opportunities for monetization. Who exactly gets to get the money, right? Like, for example, if you look at their PostgreSQL case, for many years, their EDB was that, big 800-pound gorilla, right? Like in this case, right? Really in the PostgreSQL ecosystem, right? But now you can see the cloud vendors have taken a lot of that, right? I think if you look at number of contributors, right, or share of them employed by cloud vendors have been increased, right? So that really changes here. Now here I think it's good to think about the open source projects from a way of what can I put in it two big groups, right? From the standpoint of ownership and governance. One of them, which I will call like a foundation-based open source, or community-based open source, right? Or you can think about like a multi-vendor open source, right? I don't think there's like a quite very good settled name for that, but this is, well, something like Postgres. There is not a single vendor which owns a product, right? But there is an ecosystem, right? And the project is run for benefit of everybody, right? Linux Foundation, CNCF, Apache Foundation, right? These are also examples, right, under which umbrella could be a lot of projects. And if you think about, oh God, sorry, I got, yeah, sorry, wrong button. So now, if you think about their those guys for foundation-based open source, they actually tend to really love a relationship with cloud. Because again, well, it helps adoption. It makes their project more successful. And you know what? The fact that now there are different sponsors of a project does not quite matter. That still makes community helpful. If you now think about a single vendor, though, situation is different, right? If you think about somebody like MongoDB, well, in reality, what MongoDB cares the most about is making sure the MongoDB is the most successful, profitable, high-value, like a public company, right? Of course, they don't really like a competition, right? If MongoDB is 10 times better, but MongoDB Corporation makes 10 times less money, that is not a trade-off which is interesting for them. Though, of course, it would be for MongoDB users, right? And what that brings us to, what we see a lot of customers have fully or partly abandoned their open source licenses. Well, some of them, like Elastic, actually kind of pulled back a little bit, right, and reintroduced some open source version, right? Now, if you think about what is exactly the primary goal of that license change? Well, that is essentially creating a monopoly in the cloud. And why focus on the cloud? Well, because that is seen as the largest market. It's kind of, highest growth, right? That's have a highest valuation. Kind of your cloud revenue is valued more than your, let's say, just commercial, software revenue and so on and so forth. Now, changing the license, though, is not the only thing you can do to play the tricks with open source, right? If you think about Oracle and MySQL example, many of us feared what Oracle will change the license and make MySQL closed source. Well, they didn't, right? But what they did is they shifted a lot of development focus either on the enterprise MySQL or even kind of more specifically on the MySQL HeatWave, which is only accessible in the cloud, right? Which is another kind of problem to a way to abandon your community without doing that license change. Now, if you look at MongoDB, which I think is interesting because they were one of the first companies to change the license and a number of years has passed, we can see how it's been working out for them. And I think here, and this is a graph from the DB Engines, which is one of like a pretty respected source of data about the database adoption, we can see where at some point the MongoDB was even exceeding PostgreSQL popularity. Then we can see somewhere like after license change, it's been on a trend down, while PostgreSQL continues growth. Now, of course, correlation is not causation, right? Let me face that, right? Be very, very clear. But there may be some impact out there. What I think is also interesting, what has been happening here, is what I will call the rise of protective forks. In the MongoDB times, what happened when MongoDB changed their license? Well, for various reasons, nothing happened, right? And I think everybody, other company says, oh, that is fantastic. So we can also kind of change the license and, nothing happens, right? But it happened in other cases. When Elastic changed the license, where OpenSearch was born, when HashiCorp Terraform, OpenTF was created rather quickly. But I think the most interesting for me is what happened when Redis changed the license, right? In this case, we can see the Linux Foundation, one of the very respected forces in open source industry, really kind of very quickly, not in years or months, but in weeks, right, they came together to announce the fork, Valky, right? And what is also fantastic in this case is what we see as kind of very broad coordination of a lot of vendors which compete in other cases, right? You can see Google Cloud, AWS, and Oracle all working together on Valky project support, right? Which is wonderful. And I think the good thing in this case, right, is not just the Valky, right? But I think what that is going to make other people think, hey, if you are hostile to your community, it doesn't mean what community just have to take it, right? There can be the action to fork, right? And there is a way to get like a multiple impacted folks to figure out, to band together. Okay. Now, we spoke about this license change focused on creating monopoly in the cloud. And what is exactly the problem with that? Right? We always can take the open source software, right, and go ahead and run it manually in the cloud, as we did with bare metals or VMs, right? Well, the problem here, though, is for a lot of users, the only skills they have is to run the software in the cloud, right? Now, if you think about Postgres, for example, the amount of skills you need to press a couple of clicks to deploy PostgreSQL, highly available, secured with backups in any cloud vendors is a very, very different compared to going ahead and setting up PostgreSQL cluster, backup, monitoring, and everything, right, out of the box, right? So that is very different. So that is essentially becomes no different than a proprietary software if there is a monopoly, right? And this database vendor lock-in is actually problematic. Especially problematic over long term, right? Because initially it may be kind of priced to make sure it's not overly expensive, so you kind of lock in, adopt it, right? And then finally, you can be leveraged. Well, some folks, probably in the older generation, they have seen that before, right? This is Larry Ellison, and in a good old days, Larry was saving everybody from this hardware lock-in and dominance of a nasty big blue called IBM. Well, there were the days, right? But then, finally, when he saved everybody, well, things changed. How many of you would tell now Oracle is a company which saves everybody from vendor lock-in? Okay, what about Oracle doesn't have customers, Oracle has hostages? Yeah, that's probably more fitting, right? Now, something in this case is worth to mention. While I talk about open source in general, I think the data in this case is kind of very special, right? Because when you think about your general software, like your stateless applications, it's very easy to move around. The data is not, right? If you have placed a lot of data in some kind of storage system, software, cloud vendor, it's kind of hard to move it, right? What we talk about that as data has gravity, right? It's kind of heavy, hard to move, and also it attracts application because you're likely to run applications close to your data for a variety of reasons. And because of that, you will see what the data loved by a lot of investors, right? This is something I hear a lot. They say, oh, databases, they are wonderful. They're mission critical and they're very sticky, so people are going to pay for them and then we'll have a lot of pricing power, right? That is why I think there's a lot of focus in the business community on that, right? And I think with that, and to give it data gravity, it's important to focus on that, right? If you think about, hey, in my business, I want more freedom, less vendor lock-in, embrace the open source. I think your data layer, where you store your data, is a great thing to start because that empowers you flexibility in other cases as well. Okay, now we've had all doom and gloom, right, and open source and certification, and let us talk about some maybe good sides. So one thing I like in this case is to show this graph by Bruce, right? I don't know if it's data-driven or he just invented it, but who cares, right? It's a fantastic marketing. Yes, well, and I think it's also true in many cases, right? We see the open source is kind of, takes a time, but often it overtakes their open source software. For me, the good example was when I was starting with Linux, what it was like late 90s, early 2000s, right? And at that time, a lot of my friends work in the Linux ecosystem, they work in the real Linux, like Solaris. And Linux was a joke, right? If you remember at that time, it's typically like a 32 bits, doesn't have a multiple CPU support. Well, you couldn't even create a file more than 2 gigabytes in size, right? That was, complete joke. And well, now, a bunch of years after, how many of you still running Solaris here? No? Anyone? Well, I think we are seeing the opportunity for the same things happening in the cloud, right? There, we can now see a lot of work going on in the ways of treating cloud as a commodity, similar to kind of hardware in the previous generation of open source, and getting the most value through the open source software. Because in my opinion, clouds are wonderful, right? It's not good for us to go ahead and, rack our own servers, right? This fact we can get the hardware and other infrastructure, in minutes and scalable. That is awesome, right? But then that is pretty much what we need, and we can build the rest using the open source software. I think in this regard, it's good to show this interesting slide, which come actually from AWS presentation. They have to educate everybody about their cloud, and they talk about comparing that it to electricity, right? Electricity, it does make sense for us to run our own generators, at least kind of on a regular basis. Well, fantastic, and I agree with that, right? But the good thing with electricity, it's commodity, it's standardized, right? Like, I can use my laptop independently from where I get my electricity, right? But that is not what Amazons of this world want to do, right? They want to make sure, you use their electricity and the other stuff, which only will work if you buy electricity from them. So the important thing is what we don't have to do that. Now, if you look what has been happening in this space, I think Kubernetes is very important, right? That has been coming out as this unified API, which is ubiquitous. It's, of course, have been initially designed for stateless applications, which are very far from databases, but it has been getting better for stateful applications. And we have solutions such as Kubernetes operators for many open source databases. And PostgreSQL is not an exception. Actually, PostgreSQL has multiple operators which exist in this space. So if you think about this kind of a state of art and simplicity, right? Well, is Kubernetes and operators the same as database as a service? Well, not quite. It gives us kind of a different UX. In certain cases, it's better UX, right? Infrastructure as a code, kind of GitOps, right, which Kubernetes integrates very nicely with, is fantastic, but not everybody wants that, right? Some people say, hey, I want my kind of GUI so I can deploy a database, right? Kubernetes doesn't quite provide that. But Kubernetes can be used as a building block for building database as a service experience. Well, and that's not just theory. If you look at many modern database as a service solutions, they are built on a Kubernetes on the back, right? And that tells us what we can actually configure Kubernetes to run with a low overhead, high performance and high reliability. If you are looking for a graphical user interface for this environment, you can also check out this project what Percona has been working on. It's called Percona Everest, and that provides you kind of graphical user interface to deploy and manage open source database on Kubernetes, including Postgres. Okay. The next topic I wanted to talk about briefly is their database innovation. What has been happening in the latest few years? I think distributed databases has been a very important development, right? A lot of the new databases which are started, they kind of designed to be distributed on the ground, from the ground up. What is interesting, though, I think we can get a lot from a single node as well, right? I recently did a poll on my LinkedIn, right? I think I got a lot of people, especially from Postgres, right, voting for, hey, we can actually, with a more modern hardware, get a lot of data from a single node. But of course, even if you talk about 100 terabyte, right, or petabyte, that is still not enough to run the largest systems out there. Something like a Facebook wouldn't fit on a single node, and I think that is an interesting trend to watch. The second one, which is very interesting, is a separation of storage and compute, right? That is coming from us from the analytical databases. You can see there are solutions like Neon in the Postgres space, which are working on this solution, right? And I would kind of follow that. And that is kind of connected to another trend, which is serverless. And of course, serverless is kind of misnomer, right, to certain cases. We still have a servers which are going to run that databases. But the idea of a serverless is, as a developer, as a user of a database, you don't have to think in the context of a service to provision that, right? You're just saying, hey, I want a database which is able to kind of to handle the load I need. Well, and that is what you want as a developer. And then, as wherever my infrastructure provider, whether that be an internal team, right, or a cloud vendor, you guys figure it out. The next thing to touch on is their data pipelines and integration. I think that has been very important. What we see, because now people often run, multiple databases, or often have a data sources, right? We are looking to move the data between the databases. For example, Kafka. Anybody heard about Kafka? Right? Very popular, especially large enterprise deployments, right? Or we can also see in a PostgreSQL space, there is this interest and desire how to access the data in other sources, right? There is PostgreSQL forwarders, for example, for accessing the data which is stored in MySQL, MongoDB, and all kind of other data sources, right? We're really thinking about, hey, we want to have that integrated approach, and it makes it easier to move the data around as you want and access all the data we have from that single source, wherever it is, right? For example, Postgres. We also have a trend where multiple databases are being deployed, right? From what we hear, we spoke to organizations, very few just say, hey, we only have one database, right? Typically, it's more than one. And there is different trends for that. One is microservices, right? The microservices concept is every microservice can own its data, and its development team can choose what is the most appropriate data store is. Developer authority, another important one. In the past, you may have, this is my database team, and in my enterprise, only one database is chosen for all application development, right? Or maybe it's kind of 2 or 3. Now it's often developers choose what you want to build the application, fast and build an awesome application. And the third one is, of course, the cloud. Because the cloud enables developers, without having an operational experience of database, deploy, evaluate, right, or deploy in a production database in just, a few short clicks, right? I think that is all going to continue. We also see there are different models. And for me, that is kind of very interesting because when I started studying in the school, and again, that was like late 90s, we were learning about the other database. There was this kind of object databases, and there have been, XML databases, right? And there have been, some other like navigational databases, right? Whatever. And then you would see the only thing which is used is relational databases, right? And that was the answer, right? And 90% plus dominance, right? Now, we just see the other special purpose data structure and optimized database. You think about time series, graphs, data structures like Redis, vector search databases, you name it. But it's not also just single choice of a database technology. What we see, a lot of databases becoming the multimodal databases. And a PostgreSQL is not exception. It's actually leading the way, right? You can store, JSON data in Postgres. You can store vectors. It has a support for JS data, right, and so on and so forth. A lot of stuff can be used with Postgres. What you also see, which I think is quite interesting, is many databases now embrace the open protocols. Well, like Postgres for communication, right? And some of them even support multiple protocols for ease of use. You can think about solutions like ClickHouse, which speaks that's an analytical database, which speaks both ClickHouse native protocol as well as MySQL or Postgres. Right? We have other interesting development like FerretDB, which is like a tiny proxy, but which allows you to talk MongoDB protocol when your data is stored in Postgres. Right? So I think that's kind of very interesting innovation about how we can all play together is very interesting. Vector search is another important thing. Well, everything AI kind of gets a lot of attention, those days, and so that is very important. I think there will be more talks about it, right? I'll just touch on maybe one thing here is some folks ask, well, if you speak about AI application and vectors, what does it have to do anything, right? When I enter something in ChatGPT, there is no vectors there. Well, yes, that's true, right? But internally, a lot of AI applications, a lot of a complicated math, which works with matrices and vectors, right? And that is why dealing with those kind of vectors in a database becomes important. And it also needs a special support because our classical database, the index structures like with B-trees, we don't work for core operations which we need to do with vectors. Okay, now let's finally move to talk about Postgres. Now, we can really talk right now what we have a era of Postgres, right? I would also cite the same graph from Stack Overflow, which you all love, right? About the PostgreSQL is the most adopted database those days. And if you look at the graph of this kind of like a big open source and source available competition, the MySQL, MongoDB, and Postgres, you can see that Postgres is the only one which is growing. And I think right now you may think about, well, of course it is. That was inevitable. But for me, somebody who was involved in the MySQL in early 2000s, well, that it may not be necessary so, right? In that time, things were kind of different, right? And this is one of the pictures from the era I like, which indicates how PostgreSQL community was feeling kind of very, I don't know, let's say, yeah. Anyway, I think the picture says it. Now, when I talk to some folks in a PostgreSQL ecosystem, we often like to attribute that to the awesome engineering. Say, hey, have you, Peter, looked at the PostgreSQL code and the MySQL code? Isn't PostgreSQL code is so much better? And yes, perhaps, but it's not good enough. It's not enough, right? I mean, unfortunately, we see in this world in so many cases, best technologies do not win. So what, in my opinion, were drivers of a PostgreSQL success in recent years? One, I think, is a cloud impact, right? Because cloud made PostgreSQL easy. I have heard, let's say 10 years ago, from so many people, we developers love Postgres. It has like awesome features, but you know what? We can't really operate it. It's too complicated. Well, compared to MySQL, which was focused on ease of use, right? Now, cloud hides that from you. The license, that is another important thing, right? The fact that PostgreSQL has a permissive license allowed a lot of commercial alternatives to build exist, right? And kind of funnel money back to the ecosystem. And also that allows you to embed PostgreSQL in your applications, even in the commercial, right? Which you cannot with MySQL unless you go and buy the enterprise license, right? Which, especially if Oracle becomes an interesting adventure. We also have MySQL, which got acquired by Oracle through being kind of bought by Sun, and then Sun bought by Oracle. And that, of course, has a lot of concerns in that space about MySQL future. Right? I think in that stage, we also have their Monty, their MySQL founder, have been very much bashing Oracle and spearing like, oh, Oracle is going to kill MySQL. Well, he ended up creating MariaDB, but I think the database he actually helped the most is Postgres, right? Because if you really want to stay away from all that freaking MySQL drama, right, and really be sure what the future is great and it's independent from all of that stuff, welcome to Postgres. We also have a cloud vendor support for Postgres, which is awesome, and again connected to that community ownership. Because if you think for Amazon's, right, or Google's, Microsoft's, right, wherever, it is much better to send your customers kind of to and promote the PostgreSQL brand, right, compared to the brand which your competition has, right? It's just business. Then there is politics, and what I mean by that is, especially think like after pandemic, world became kind of fucked, right? I mean, you wouldn't agree, right? So many strange things happening, right? And you can see a lot of people kind of becoming concerned, right? Like, well, if I am using a software which is owned by this kind of, commercial US company, right? Am I safe from sanctions, trade wars, right? And so on and so forth, right? And something which is really that, open source, right? And really community governed as Postgres is, much more protected from that. I also think what is very important, because it's really a community project, everybody owns Postgres. And if you think about that really created this fantastic grassroots vendor community, right? And I specifically talk about the vendors because these are guys who have, stake in the game. They are ready to invest the money. In this case, like if you look at here, for example, you can see how many local vendors making money on Postgres, right, are helping to make this event happen. And because of that, you can actually see probably every week there is a PostgreSQL event happening somewhere, right? And there would be, as I travel the world, often like, oh, I didn't know what there is some, PostgreSQL companies which are doing this, awesome thing in Brazil, right, or other places. Then finally, there is extensibility, right? And I think that is paying off very much right now, right? And PostgreSQL became so ubiquitous, but it allows you to build a lot of awesome things on PostgreSQL quickly and without actually, permission from PostgreSQL core team, right, or something. It's just build extension, right? And we can see awesome things, like a timescale DB for, for time series, like a vector search, have appeared kind of very quickly, and often you have even kind of more than one implementation for something, for some problem. Okay, finally, let's talk about maybe concerns, right, if you will, right? And I like this phrase, right, in this case. What got you here won't necessarily get you there, right? What is about the next 10 years for Postgres? What are potential challenges? Well, one is AI, right? And AI kind of, scary thing, we just kind of can change everything. But I think that is a good question to ask, right? Because the databases, including Postgres, right, were designed for people. In many cases, think about we compete on, oh, this database is easier for human developers to use. Well, what if we'll see different ways to build the applications with a different AI involvement? What would that look when a database needs to be convenient for AI rather than a human, right? I think that is an interesting question to ask. The next thing is there is a generational transitioning going on, right? You probably have heard some people saying what there are a lot of gray-haired people in Postgres. And well, I think many people agree gray hair actually kind of looks sexy, right? But the thing is, what we also got to recognize that people who draw their Postgres for the last 30 years probably is not going to continue doing that for the next 30 years. So some sort of transition need to happen, and that is always the risk. And I think that also connects to the second one, right? If you think about the PostgreSQL, it is kind of unique in a way of a governance it has, right? It's not very kind of structured in the same way as many other foundations. It's kind of somewhere kind of, opaque, right? And that has some risks, especially as you think about their transition, right, of a generational transition. The thing about their PostgreSQL core team, what makes it awesome, right? Because a lot of people started Postgres when PostgreSQL was, nothing, right? They just had the ideas, right? And they wanted to work hard to make it happen. Now, PostgreSQL is actually has billions of dollars of a value, right? And that means, well, there is, can be different kind of people being attracted to the leadership role in a project for their own reasons, right? And that is a risk. Then there is conservatism, right? I think the PostgreSQL folks are often like very proud. Hey, we are, especially in a core Postgres, are very kind of conservative. We kind of move slow, right? And frankly, we can see what that served, PostgreSQL well. But we also have to understand what the pace of innovation has been accelerating, right? And that may be one of the challenges. Now, with all of that, you may ask, well, Peter, but what do you think about the PostgreSQL future, right? Is it great or not so great? I will be honest. I am actually very optimistic about the PostgreSQL future, right? Everything has some problems, right? But I think PostgreSQL is in that awesome position compared to all the other players in the ecosystem. One thing I see about Postgres, though, is that is going to be #1 open source database for new application development. What I frankly do not believe is there will be only Postgres, everything else will die. And I think that is a good thing, because in my opinion, the monopoly creates complacency. And complacency is, in the end, bad, right? So even if a PostgreSQL is the best and kind of leading a database, we need that kind of competition to push ourselves to be our best, and frankly, to learn from. And with that, that's all I had to say, and thank you.